1960s, a small southern town. The old church groans under the summer heat, stained glass glowing like fire. Wooden pews creak as families fan themselves, waiting for the sermon to end. But then the preacher's voice cracks like a whip. "Elvis Presley's music is the devil's work." The words ripple through the congregation. Older faces nod grimly, satisfied to see sin condemned. Yet in the back rows, the youth stiffen. Their eyes burn with something between hurt and defiance. They remember where his songs began, not in nightclubs or on television, but here, in churches like this, when he was a boy singing gospel beside his mother. A whisper breaks the silence, soft but dangerous. But Elvis grew up in the choir. His voice was born here. The room tightens. The clash is no longer about music. It is about identity, faith, and a generation split in two. How can the same boy who once lifted hymns with innocent devotion now be condemned as a symbol of corruption? The air is thick with judgment, yet behind it lingers a question no one dares to speak aloud. What if the devil they fear is not in Elvis's songs, but in their refusal to listen? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The summers in Tupelo, Mississippi, carried a weight of heat that clung to the skin and settled in the lungs. Dust lifted with every step along the red clay roads, floating lazily before collapsing again onto porches, where tired families sat in silence at the end of the day. It was here, in a two-room house built by neighbors and relatives, that a boy named Elvis grew up in the company of his mother, Gladys, and his father, Vernon. They had little more than each other, and the conviction that faith could keep hunger from swallowing their hope whole. Elvis remembered the sound of his mother's voice more vividly than the taste of food on their table. When she sang, even the thinnest cornbread meal seemed like a feast. On Sundays, she would take him by the hand, dress him in the cleanest shirt she could find, and lead him through the small streets to the First Assembly of God Church. The building itself was modest, its wooden benches worn smooth by generations, its air heavy with perfume, dust, and the faint smell of pine resin. But when the congregation raised their voices, it felt as if the roof might lift right off the rafters. The gospel choir was the boy's first orchestra. He watched the women sway in their dresses, clapping hands in rhythm, the men stamping feet like the ground itself was joining the song. The harmonies rolled and surged, not polished, but raw and alive. When Gladys leaned down and whispered for Elvis to join in, his shy murmur barely carried beyond his own chest. Yet, each week, she encouraged him. By the time he was 10, his voice had grown enough to weave into the larger sound. It wasn't performance. It was prayer. He sang with eyes closed, head tilted slightly upward, as though he were sending his voice not toward the people around him, but higher, somewhere unreachable. Neighbors noticed. "That boy's got a gift," they would say after service, patting Gladys on the arm. She would smile modestly, though inside she was fiercely proud. For Elvis, those early Sundays imprinted a truth that would follow him his entire life. Music was a form of faith, and faith a kind of music. But the outside world was harder, colder. The Great Depression had scarred the South. Men lined up at mills and farms for day labor, sometimes turned away before their boots touched the porch steps. Vernon's missteps with the law, passing a bad check in desperate times, only deepened their struggle. Through it all, Gladys kept the boy close, insisting that no matter how lean the pantry became, their spirits must not starve. The church was their sanctuary, and Elvis clung to it, not out of duty, but out of need. Then came the early 1950s, when the boy who once sang timidly from a pew began to take bolder steps. In Memphis, far from the familiar rhythms of Tupelo, he found himself drawn to music outside the church walls. Rhythm and blues echoing from Beale Street, country ballads drifting from jukeboxes, the sharp pulse of black gospel quartets on the radio late at night. It wasn't rebellion. To him, it was a widening circle of the same truth, a yearning voice reaching upward, whether in a chapel or on a street corner. When he recorded That's All Right in 1954 at Sun Studio, it was meant to be little more than a playful run-through, a burst of nervous energy to pass the time. Yet as soon as the tape rolled, something shifted. The blend of blues phrasing, country twang, and church-bred urgency spilled out of him as naturally as breathing. Sam Phillips, the producer, leaned in, eyes sharp. "What are you doing, son?" Elvis only shrugged. "I don't know. Just singing." That single, once played on local radio, struck like lightning. Teenagers who had never set foot in his childhood church began combing their hair back with pomade to look like him, practicing his shaky leg movements, imitating his southern drawl. But the reaction was not all praise. In Tupelo, where voices once encouraged him in church, whispers grew sharper. Some congregants muttered that the boy they had known was selling sin. Pastors thundered from pulpits that his twisting body and pounding rhythms were a gateway to damnation. Parents yanked their children away from the record stores that displayed his photo, the same hands that had once clapped in church when young Elvis sang hymns now wagged fingers of judgment. One summer evening, a group of boys arrived at church sporting slick pompadours like Elvis. The pastor stopped mid-sermon, glaring at them. "The devil wears a sneer and a curl," he spat, sending titters of laughter through the older members. The boys, red-faced, tugged at their collars but refused to move. That moment, Elvis's presence hung in the room without him ever stepping foot inside. Newspapers carried headlines that left no doubt about the moral panic. "Presley corrupts our youth," "The sinful pelvis." Articles painted him as a menace, an icon of decline. And in Tupelo, anonymous letters began arriving at the Presley household. Some scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Shame on your boy. He drags God's name through the mud." Others, darker still, threatening, penned by neighbors they once greeted on Sundays. Gladys would fold them quietly, hiding them in a drawer so Elvis wouldn't see. But he always sensed her unease. The sting was sharper because he remembered their faces, the very people who had once lifted hymns beside him. Their judgment wasn't abstract. It came from those who had knelt in the same pews. And though his fame was rising, though his records sold faster than stores could stock them, that wound never healed easily. He had never thought of his music as rebellion. To him, it was an extension of the same spirit that filled those Sunday mornings. Yet now, as he walked onto stages surrounded by screaming fans, he carried with him not only the thrill of the crowd, but also the heavy weight of that rejection. In every note, somewhere behind the rhythm, was a question. How could the same songs born of prayer be condemned as wicked? By the mid-1960s, the world around Elvis Presley had changed, but the fire of controversy that trailed him had not burned out. It had grown more focused, more personal. His fame was no longer new. It was towering, nearly mythic. Records filled jukeboxes, films of uneven quality churned through theaters, and his face appeared in magazines beside politicians and movie stars. To millions of young people, he was more than an entertainer. He was a compass pointing toward freedom of expression. But to certain ministers across the South, he was something darker, a reminder of how quickly old traditions could slip through their fingers. In small towns from Mississippi to Alabama, sermons turned his name into a warning. A preacher in Birmingham thundered from his pulpit, "The boy in sequins dances with the devil. Do not let your children be seduced by the howls of his guitar." Congregants nodded, some with unease, others with conviction. It was not uncommon by then to hear the sound of a needle scratching across vinyl as parents pulled the plug on their children's record players mid-song. And then came the spectacles, rituals that seemed almost medieval in their intensity. Outside churches and schoolhouses, pastors organized what they called cleansings. Piles of Presley records, photographs, and fan magazines were stacked high, gasoline splashed over them, and matches struck in the name of righteousness. Flames twisted and roared, reflecting in the wide eyes of teenagers forced to watch as their prized possessions curled into ash. Some cried openly, others clenched their fists, refusing to show weakness. The elders stood behind the fires, chanting hymns, believing they were safeguarding the souls of their youth. But the young did not quietly obey. At the edges of these gatherings, murmurs of anger spread. Groups of boys snuck their Elvis records back into bedrooms, hiding them beneath mattresses or wrapping them in brown paper so parents wouldn't know. Girls scribbled his name in school notebooks, replacing hearts with lightning bolts. For them, his songs were not rebellion against God, but against silence, against lives predetermined by elders who demanded obedience above all else. The battle was not only public, it was painfully personal for Elvis. In Memphis, a local paper published an open letter from a Southern pastor who had once railed against him from the pulpit. This time the attack was explicit. Our youth no longer hum hymns of salvation. They hum the rhythms of a false prophet in a leather jacket. They worship at the altar of Elvis Presley, who twists his body in mockery of virtue. The words struck deeper than reviews from cynical critics ever could. This was not a stranger's opinion. It was a denunciation from the very institution that had once nurtured his earliest songs. Letters poured into his home, both adoring and hateful. Some were from children thanking him for giving them courage to dream. Others from parents demanding he repent before he doomed an entire generation. Among them was one that froze him in place. A teenage girl wrote in careful handwriting, "I told my choir teacher that you were my hero. They expelled me from the church group, said I was no longer welcome, but I still believe in you." Enclosed was a small ribbon from the choir robe she had once worn, folded neatly as though it were an offering. Elvis carried that letter around for weeks, folded and refolded until the creases nearly split the paper. He showed it to his close circle one evening, his voice low and heavy. They took music away from her, something meant to lift her soul, and they used it as punishment, because she believed in me. He placed the letter back into his pocket and stared off into the distance. "I can't fight the church. I won't stand against God, but I won't deny where my music came from either." The contradiction gnawed at him. Every rehearsal, every concert, he could feel the tension between the joyful shouts of his fans and the condemning echoes of sermons. He remembered the gospel harmonies of his youth, the nights when Gladys would hum beside him until he fell asleep, and he wondered, how could those same sounds now be weaponized against him? One evening, sitting alone at Graceland, he opened his mother's worn Bible. Its pages were fragile, corners frayed, her handwriting marking passages of comfort. His fingers lingered on a verse she had underlined, "Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands." He whispered it aloud, almost as if trying to reassure himself. For him, music had always been a joyful noise. Yet, in the eyes of many, It had become a threat, a noise that lured the innocent away. Meanwhile, the division across America sharpened. Youth clung to Elvis not only for his voice, but for what he symbolized, the possibility of living on their own terms. Elders clung to the church and tradition with equal fervor, convinced that a generation was slipping into moral chaos. And in the middle stood Elvis Presley himself, pulled in both directions, the boy from Tupelo who never imagined his songs would one day be burned in public squares like forbidden scriptures. The firestorms and denunciations didn't halt his career. They could not. But they carved wounds that fame could not heal. To the crowds, he was untouchable. To himself, he was still a child of Sunday choirs, bewildered by the way those same sanctuaries now cast stones at him. By 1968, Elvis Presley's life had become a strange mixture of glitter and shadows. On one hand, his fame was as radiant as ever. Millions still flocked to see his films, and his face sold everything from lunchboxes to perfume. On the other, he felt hollowed out, like the shine on a coin rubbed away from too many hands. Years of formulaic Hollywood movies had dulled his fire. His concerts were sparse. His records lacked the hunger of his early days. When he looked into the mirror, the boy from Tupelo was still there, but blurred beneath layers of image and expectation. That year, however, something stirred in him. NBC had offered a televised special, initially framed as a safe holiday program. But Elvis insisted it become something else entirely, a rebirth. The so-called '68 comeback special would strip away the artifice, show him raw, dressed in black leather, performing with the same urgency that had once ignited radio stations across the South. He wanted to prove, to himself most of all, that the fire hadn't gone out. It was during rehearsals for that special, as the studio lights glared and old songs found new breath, that unexpected news reached him. A letter arrived, not from a fan, but from a clergyman in Tennessee. The name was familiar. This was no friendly figure. Years earlier, this same preacher had railed against him in sermons, accusing him of corrupting teenagers with jungle rhythms and satanic dances. Now, astonishingly, the man was inviting Elvis to attend a church gathering. The reason, the letter claimed, was simple. Many parishioners, despite earlier condemnations, longed to hear him sing gospel again. They remembered that beneath the swiveling hips and sequined suits was a boy raised on hymns. Some even whispered that his gospel recordings were more moving than his rock hits. The minister wrote, in a tone caught between concession and challenge, "If you dare to show the world that your faith still lives, come stand among us. Let the Lord judge if your music carries his spirit." When Elvis read it aloud to his inner circle, the room fell quiet, then erupted in arguments. His manager, Colonel Parker, dismissed it instantly. "They'll use you, boy. They'll humiliate you and print it in every paper. Don't walk into their trap." Friends echoed the warning. Why expose himself to more ridicule, especially now, when his career was poised for renewal? But Elvis sat back, staring at the folded letter. "If it's a trap," he said slowly, "then it's mine to walk into. I won't go for them. I won't go for the press. I'll go for God. If I sing there, it's not to prove anything to the pastor. It's to remind myself where I came from." His words silenced the room. He wasn't defensive, just resolved, as if a decision had already taken root inside him. For weeks, while finishing the television special, the thought of that invitation lingered like a weight in his pocket. He remembered the little church pews of Tupelo, the harmonies of the gospel choirs, his mother's proud smile when he lifted his voice. The idea of returning, even under hostile eyes, pulled at him like gravity. When the day of the event arrived, The church was swollen with anticipation. Word had spread far beyond the congregation. Families crammed into pews, reporters set up cameras, and curious onlookers lined the walls. The atmosphere buzzed with conflicting emotions. Some came to witness redemption, others to savor another scandal. Young fans, clutching hymnals with Elvis's name scribbled on the margins, whispered nervously. Older parishioners crossed arms tightly, prepared to resist whatever spectacle might unfold. The air was thick with tension, like the charged stillness before a storm. Outside, children balanced on curbs trying to catch a glimpse of his arrival. Inside, even the stained glass windows seemed to glow more fiercely as afternoon light slanted through them. For many, this was not just a church service. It was a test of faith, a trial staged before God and the public eye alike. As Elvis's car pulled up quietly, flashes of cameras broke the calm. He stepped out not in flamboyant costume, but in a simple dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his face unreadable. Walking toward the entrance, he could feel the heat of gazes pressing down from every direction. He did not wave, did not smile. His stride was steady, almost solemn, as though he were entering a courtroom rather than a sanctuary. When he crossed the threshold, the whispers hushed into a deep silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him. Some softened with recognition, remembering the boy who once sang hymns at the back of the choir. Others narrowed, clinging to old judgments. The smell of polished wood and candle wax hung in the air, mixing with the unspoken tension that crackled like static. Everyone waited, for the sermon, for confrontation, for spectacle. And Elvis, moving to a seat near the front, folded his hands, bowed his head slightly, and prepared himself. He had come not for approval, not for defense, but for something older and deeper. What he did not know, as he sat beneath the pulpit's shadow, was that this night would test him in ways louder than any concert stage, more intimate than any recording booth. The gathering had become less a service than a reckoning. And as the minister stepped forward, Bible in hand, voices in the pews held their breath, bracing for what would come next. The church was heavy with expectation. Even before the first words of the sermon, the air seemed swollen with judgment. Elvis sat near the front, shoulders squared, hands clasped loosely in his lap. The pew beneath him creaked as he shifted slightly, its wooden frame echoing more loudly than it should have, as though the building itself amplified every sound he made. The preacher who had extended the invitation rose to the pulpit. His robe caught the light from the stained glass windows, and his voice, when it broke the silence, carried with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to command. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "we gather tonight not only to praise the Lord, but to face the dangers that have wormed their way into the hearts of our young." His eyes swept across the congregation, resting for an almost imperceptible moment on Elvis himself. The words were sharp, but disguised in the velvet tone of religious authority. He spoke of cultural decay, of the erosion of virtue, and of music that turned worship into frenzy. "The body," he thundered, "is a temple." Yet some twist it into spectacle, leading others astray. Songs once meant to lift the spirit are turned into bait for the flesh. Murmurs of agreement rose from older parishioners. They leaned forward, nodding, lips tight with satisfaction. Elvis remained motionless, though he felt the stairs drilling into him. The wooden floor beneath his polished shoes creaked faintly as his heel pressed down unconsciously. He inhaled slowly, letting the sound of the sermon wash over him, every phrase like a stone tossed in his direction. Then came the shift. The preacher leaned closer to the pulpit, his voice narrowing, no longer general, but direct. And here among us sits the very emblem of this struggle, he declared. Heads turned instantly. A ripple of unease swept through the pews. Elvis Presley, the preacher said, his voice rolling the name as though it were both a warning and a challenge. You have climbed the stages of the world. You have filled the air with sound. But what will you say when the Lord asks, "What did you do with the gift I gave you? Did you build his kingdom or mock it?" Gasps broke from the crowd. Some whispered, others shifted uncomfortably. A few, mostly elders, clapped their hands together in agreement, shouting, "Amen!" Cameras clicked as journalists leaned forward, eager, ready to capture confrontation. The weight of every gaze landed on Elvis. He lifted his head, eyes calm but steady, and looked back at the man in the pulpit. For a heartbeat, no one else seemed to exist. His silence was more unnerving than an argument would have been. Children peered over pews, waiting for an explosion. Young fans clenched hymnals tightly, unsure whether to defend him or to stay quiet. The preacher continued, sensing the tension rising. "Tell us, Mr. Presley. Tell this congregation. Tell these children. Tell your Maker. What answer do you have? Will you admit before this house of God that you have tempted souls away from the path of righteousness?" The silence afterward was suffocating. Even the ceiling fans, spinning lazily above, seemed to pause. Elvis could hear the faint rustle of a dress hem brushing wood, the faint tapping of a nervous foot against the floorboards. His own pulse thudded steadily, betraying none of the storm inside him. What surprised the crowd most was not his defensiveness. There was none. It was the composure. The way his gaze remained fixed, unblinking, his posture unshaken. A murmur rose at the back. "Why doesn't he fight back?" whispered a young man. Another replied, "Because he doesn't have to." The preacher, emboldened by the quiet, raised his voice further, his hands pounding the pulpit. "Every man will stand before God's throne and answer for what he has done. You, Mr. Presley, are no exception. The glitter of fame cannot blind the eyes of the Almighty. Do you deny that your music has stirred desire rather than devotion?" The sting of the words cut through the church. Young girls lowered their heads, ashamed, while some older men muttered their agreement. But many simply waited. They sensed something building, something heavier than argument. Elvis did not rise. He did not shout back. Instead, he let the storm rage around him. The shouts, the murmurs, the clicking of reporters' cameras desperate to capture the moment. His silence was deliberate, a still point in the chaos, an anchor in a sea of noise. For a moment, it seemed the preacher had won, that his thunder had pinned Elvis into submission. But then came the strange realization spreading through the pews. The louder the sermon grew, the calmer Presley appeared. The fire of accusation only threw into relief the steadiness of the man accused. In that hush between one shouted sentence and the next, the contrast could not have been starker. A voice of condemnation rang against the rafters, yet all eyes drifted toward the silent figure in the pew, his face serene, almost prayerful. And when the preacher paused for breath, sweating under the weight of his own fury, the church itself seemed to wait, not for more thunder, but for the quiet response that might follow. The preacher's words still hung in the rafters like smoke that refused to clear. All eyes remained fixed on Elvis, as though the entire church had become a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Yet he did not argue. He did not defend. Instead, with slow deliberation, he reached into the breast pocket of his dark suit and pulled out something small and worn, a thin notebook, its corners bent, its cover faded from years of handling. It was not a prop. It was the very notebook his mother had once kept for him when he was a boy in Tupelo, filled with scraps of lyrics copied from hymnals and lines he had scrawled in uneven handwriting. On the first page, his mother had written in careful script, "Sing unto the Lord a new song." He had carried it with him on tours, tucked into luggage during army service, kept close even when movie sets felt like prisons. Tonight, for reasons he could hardly explain, he had brought it with him. The room leaned forward. Reporters poised pens over notepads, uncertain of what would happen next. The preacher froze, one hand still on the pulpit, lips parted, but silent. Elvis rose slowly, the wooden floor groaning under his weight. He stood straight, holding the notebook in his hands like a fragile relic. He opened it to a familiar page, his eyes scanning the words he had known since childhood. Then, without introduction, without musicians, without even a microphone, he began to sing. The first notes of Peace in the Valley slipped into the air, unadorned and unaccompanied. His voice was softer than the booming sermons, but it carried farther, sinking into the stillness. "Oh, well, I'm tired, and so weary, but I must go along." The melody was not the slick sound of records or the dramatic performances of Las Vegas. It was stripped bare, like a prayer spoken aloud. At first, people seemed unsure how to respond. The congregation sat rigid, listening. But as the second verse rose, the tension in the room shifted. The timbre of his voice, low, tender, edged with sincerity, cut through skepticism. It was not a performance. It was remembrance. Each note carried the weight of a boy once standing beside his mother in a church choir, singing not for applause, but for solace. The hush was total. Even the journalists lowered their cameras, realizing that to snap the shutter now would break something sacred. A woman in the third row, elderly and frail, clasped her hands and began to cry softly. She had known Elvis as a child, had heard that same voice decades earlier, thinner and shy, yet unmistakably the same soul. By the final verse, the atmosphere had transformed. "There will be peace in the valley for me." His eyes remained closed, his body still. No spotlight, no orchestra, no screaming crowd, just one man and a hymn that had lived in his bones since he could remember. When the last note faded, the silence was unlike any silence the church had ever held. It was not awkward, not expectant. It was reverent. People breathed carefully, as though not to disturb what lingered in the air. Even those who moments earlier had cheered the preacher's condemnation now sat subdued, their expressions complicated. Some humbled, others shaken. And then it began. A rustle at the back, a faint sniffle from a woman wiping her eyes. Slowly, almost reluctantly, heads nodded. The very elders who had dismissed him as a corrupter of youth now recalled the boy who had grown up in their pews. A man near the front lowered his gaze, remembering how his own children once sang that hymn before bed. The song had disarmed them. Among the youth, the effect was electrifying. For years they had defended Elvis with passion, but this was different. They saw that their idol did not resist with swagger or defiance. He answered with humility, returning to the same roots they shared in their own households and churches. It was no rebellion. It was a bridge. One reporter, who had come eager for scandal, quietly set down his pen. Later, he would admit to colleagues that he could not bring himself to write about the night as controversy. It felt dishonest. "What I saw wasn't a man attacked," he would recall. "I saw a hymn silence an entire church." The preacher, who had flung accusations with such force, stood now with hands gripping the pulpit tightly. He tried to speak, but no words came. His voice, once booming, faltered against the clarity of the song still ringing in the rafters. The congregation was no longer with him. They were with the boy from Tupelo, the one who had just reminded them of something pure, something older than judgment. Elvis lowered the notebook, closing it gently as though afraid the moment would break if he moved too quickly. He did not smile or bow. He simply returned to his seat, the old wooden bench creaking once more beneath him. His eyes lowered, his hands resting on the worn cover of the songbook. He seemed almost smaller now, not the icon on billboards, but a son remembering his mother, a believer remembering his faith. And in that stillness, the truth landed harder than any argument could have. Sometimes the most powerful answer is not in words, but in the music that survives them. The last note of peace in the valley still seemed to echo, even though Elvis had fallen silent. For a long moment, the church was a vessel of stillness, every cough suppressed, every whisper swallowed. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the hymn, reluctant to let it go. Then came the pause that revealed everything. All eyes shifted to the pulpit, to the man who only minutes earlier had spoken with the thunder of certainty. The preacher cleared his throat, gripped the lectern tightly, and opened his mouth. But the words caught. What emerged was not the rolling cadence of command, but a faltering tone, thin and hesitant. He tried again, louder this time, insisting that the devil disguises himself in music. But his voice cracked, breaking against the weight of what had just been sung. The congregation felt it instantly, the change of power in the room. Where the preacher's voice had once driven the rhythm, now it was Elvis's silence that held them. The younger members were the first to break it. A girl in the second pew began clapping softly, a tentative rhythm at first, like someone afraid to draw attention. Then another pair of hands joined, then another. Soon the sound swelled, rolling through the wooden chamber like distant thunder. The elders looked around in confusion. Some frowned, others folded their arms in disapproval. But they could not deny the momentum. Young men stood, applauding with conviction. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, then rose to their feet as though pulled by something greater than choice. The applause was not wild like at a concert. It was reverent, almost liturgical, an offering of recognition rather than frenzy. Elvis did not rise to receive it. He sat still, eyes lowered, hands folded over the worn notebook. Yet the applause gathered around him like a tide, breaking through years of accusation and suspicion. The preacher attempted to continue, pounding the pulpit with the flat of his hand. "Silence! This is not a performance!" he shouted, sweat darkening the collar of his robe. But the sound of clapping only grew, until his protests drowned beneath it. An elderly man stood slowly from the back. His hair was silver, his gait unsteady, but his voice carried clear. "I was against you, boy," he called toward Elvis. "I said your music was ruin, but tonight I see it's prayer. Maybe I was blind." Murmurs of agreement followed, spreading like brush fire. The preacher, once the sole voice of authority, now seemed small against the rising chorus of ordinary believers. The journalists scribbled furiously, though some had stopped altogether, watching with wide eyes. They had expected outrage, a confrontation fit for headlines. Instead, they were witnessing something that could not be easily framed. A reversal, a fracture in the authority of the pulpit itself. One photographer lowered his camera, whispering to a colleague, "This isn't scandal. This is history." The young clapped louder, stamping their feet against the wooden floor until the whole building seemed to shake. Some elders resisted still, muttering about deception and temptation, but their voices were thin, scattered, drowned by the force of what was happening. The preacher slumped slightly, his hands still gripping the lectern as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His face was pale, his eyes darting across the pews that no longer looked to him for guidance. Elvis finally lifted his head. His expression was not triumphant, not smug. It was steady, calm, almost mournful. He had not come to humiliate anyone, least of all the preacher who now trembled before him. He had come to sing, and by doing so, he had turned the congregation away from accusation and toward recognition. The sound of applause continued, now mixed with voices calling out. "Sing another!" shouted a boy. "Bless you, Elvis," cried a woman in the back. And then, in a voice cracked with emotion, another man said, "Your mama would be proud." That line struck Elvis more deeply than any other. He swallowed hard, the memory of Gladys flooding him, her hand on his shoulder as a boy, her whisper urging him to sing with his whole heart. The preacher made one last attempt, lifting his Bible high, voice trembling. "Beware, false prophets." But the crowd no longer listened. The authority of the pulpit had been displaced. Tonight, their judgment was not guided by fear, but by the song they had just heard, a hymn that belonged to all of them. For the first time in years, Elvis felt no need to explain himself. The hymn had spoken in a language older than argument, and the people had understood. As the clapping finally softened into silence, the atmosphere shifted into something wholly new. It was no longer accusation. It was acceptance. Fragile, incomplete, but unmistakably real. The preacher lowered his Bible. His shoulders sagged, and his lips pressed shut. He had no more words. The power had slipped from his grasp, and the congregation knew it. What remained was not victory or defeat, but revelation. That music, sung in truth, could heal rifts that sermons had only widened. Elvis sat quietly, letting the moment wash over him. He was not the king of rock and roll in that instant. He was the boy from Tupelo who had once sung from a wooden pew, proving without a word that his gift was never rebellion. It was prayer set to melody. The service had officially ended, but no one moved toward the doors. The benediction had been spoken, the hymn books closed, yet the congregation lingered as though pinned to the room by an unseen weight. Clusters of people whispered, exchanged glances, or simply stared at Elvis, who sat quietly in his pew. The air was different now, no longer electric with accusation, no longer brittle with silence. It felt softened, reverent, as though everyone knew they had witnessed something they would never quite be able to explain. Elvis finally rose. The notebook remained tucked under his arm, his suit jacket slightly wrinkled from sitting so still through the storm. The wooden aisle cleared instinctively as he stepped forward. Some reached out, timidly at first, brushing his sleeve as though to test if he was real. Then hands extended, one after another. Not the clamoring hands of fans outside concert halls, but palms open in gratitude, wanting only a touch, a moment. He shook each hand with quiet respect. He signed no autographs. This was not that kind of gathering. What people wanted tonight was simpler: acknowledgement, connection. A woman in her 70s grasped his hand with surprising strength, her eyes wet. "You sang what my husband used to sing before he passed," she whispered. "It felt like he was here again." Elvis squeezed her hand gently, nodding without words. The minister who had invited him emerged from the side door of the sanctuary. His robe looked heavier now, as though the weight of the evening had settled into the fabric itself. For a moment, he said nothing, merely studied Elvis with a searching gaze. Then, voice low, he admitted, "I thought you had strayed." I believed you had left the Lord behind." He hesitated, swallowing the pride that still lingered. "But tonight, I saw differently. I misjudged you." Elvis lowered his eyes slightly, his reply nearly a whisper. "I never sang against God. Not once. I sang for people who were searching, even if they didn't know it was Him they were looking for." His words carried no bitterness, no accusation, just truth spoken gently, the way water smooths stone. The minister nodded, humbled, and stepped aside. At that moment, a girl no older than 16 emerged hesitantly from the crowd. Her hands trembled as she clutched a folded letter. Elvis recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same girl who had written months before, telling him she had been expelled from her church choir for calling him her hero. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I'm the one who wrote you. I thought you'd never read it." Tears glistened on her cheeks. "They told me I had no place in God's house if I admired you. But tonight you gave me back my song." Elvis placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his gaze soft. "Don't ever let anyone take music away from you," he said firmly. "If you sing from your heart, it belongs to Him, no matter what anyone says." The girl nodded through tears, holding on to his words as though they were a lifeline. Reporters pressed closer, smelling the possibility of a headline, their notebooks ready for sharp sound bites. But Elvis offered them none. When asked for a statement, he simply said, "Let the music speak." That's all there is. His refusal to ignite controversy left them frustrated, but it was deliberate. He wanted no quarrel, no feud splashed across morning papers. Tonight was not about scandal. It was about something quieter, deeper. Then an elderly woman, her steps unsteady, came forward carrying a book wrapped carefully in a faded cloth. She held it out with trembling hands. "This belonged to your mama," she said. Elvis froze. Slowly, reverently, he unwrapped the cloth to reveal a well-worn Bible. He recognized it instantly. The familiar cover, the faint marks in the margins. She explained that it had been passed to her family years earlier, after Gladys's death. "I've kept it safe," she said softly, "but it should be with you." Elvis's eyes shone, though he did not weep openly. He pressed the Bible against his chest, his voice breaking for the first time all evening. "Thank you," he whispered. The crowd fell silent once again, the intimacy of the moment too sacred to disturb. Around him, people lingered not out of curiosity, but out of a sense of shared witness. They had come expecting confrontation. They left having seen reconciliation. They filed out slowly, footsteps echoing on the old wooden floors, conversations hushed, as though they feared to shatter what had been created in that sanctuary. By the time Elvis stepped outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. A few stars pierced the sky above. He paused on the church steps, gripping his mother's Bible in one hand and the notebook in the other. For all the noise and the firestorms of criticism that had followed him through the years, tonight ended not in thunder, but in a kind of quiet that reached deeper than applause. He had not come seeking victory. He had not come to prove his worth to skeptics. Yet in the end, what he left behind was more lasting than triumph. A reminder that the truest defense of a man's soul is not found in argument, but in the music that rises from it. By the following week, the story had spread far beyond the walls of that Tennessee church. What reporters had expected to be a scuffle between a preacher and a singer had transformed into something they struggled to describe. The morning papers ran headlines that startled readers across the country. Presley silences accusers with hymn. Song stronger than sermon. Elvis answers the church in prayer. The photographs told their own tale. Instead of scandalous snapshots of Elvis under fire, the images showed him standing solemnly in his dark suit, hymn book in hand, eyes closed in concentration. One frame captured an elderly woman clutching his hand, tears streaking her cheeks. Another showed the congregation mid-applause, faces lifted not in frenzy, but in reverence. For once, the camera did not portray him as an idol or an entertainer, but as something simpler, a believer singing from memory. The coverage sparked debate across the South. Some ministers doubled down, preaching harder against him. One fiery pastor in Mississippi declared on radio, "Do not be fooled by honeyed tones. The wolf still prowls in sheep's clothing." Yet others hesitated. A well-known Baptist leader in Georgia admitted reluctantly in an interview, "I once saw in him only danger. But when I listened to that hymn, I heard sincerity. Perhaps the Lord uses vessels we least expect." In living rooms across America, families gathered around television sets as clips of the event aired. Networks, sensing the public fascination, replayed fragments of his hymn, not his rock numbers. Viewers saw not the gyrating showman of the 1950s, but a man stripped of stagecraft, singing words older than himself. For many parents who once forbade their children to buy his records, the broadcast planted a seed of doubt. Could it be that the boy they condemned was not leading youth away from faith, but drawing them toward it in a language they understood? Record stores felt the ripple almost immediately. Demand for Elvis's gospel recordings, albums that once sold modestly compared to his rock and roll hits, suddenly surged. "Peace in the Valley" was requested so often that shopkeepers moved it to their front displays. Teenagers who once hid their Presley records now purchased gospel compilations openly, emboldened by the headlines. In some towns, parents even bought them for their children, eager to believe that their admiration for him could coexist with their devotion to church. The irony was not lost on Elvis's inner circle. For years, critics had dismissed his gospel work as side projects, indulgences that did little to shape his career. Now, those very songs were transforming his image. One Memphis journalist wrote with astonishment, "Elvis Presley has done what few could. He has turned a hymn into a rebuttal more powerful than any sermon. He has reminded us that music, when born of faith, cannot be condemned so easily." The impact reached beyond record sales. Churches themselves began to feel the change. The very congregation where the event had taken place saw a rise in attendance the following Sundays. Curious visitors traveled from neighboring towns just to sit in the pews where Presley had sung. They whispered to one another, imagining the sound still lingering in the rafters. Some called it a miracle, others a spectacle, but either way, the sanctuary had become a place of pilgrimage. Letters poured into Graceland. Some came from pastors offering apologies, others from young people expressing relief. One teenager wrote, "When you sang, my father finally let me keep your records. He said, maybe you aren't as dangerous as he thought." Another confessed, "I've been ashamed to sing in church because I love your music, but now I know I don't have to choose." Not all were supportive, of course. Harsh telegrams arrived too, denouncing him as a deceiver, accusing him of trickery. But the sheer volume of gratitude outweighed the scorn. For every critic, there were dozens of voices thanking him for bridging a divide they had lived with for years. Elvis himself did not gloat. To his friends he said little, only that the moment in the church had not been planned as strategy. "I didn't sing for headlines," he explained one night at Graceland, sitting at the piano with the Bible his mother once held, resting nearby. "I sang because it's what I knew to do. If people heard something in it, that wasn't me. That was the Lord." Television producers, sensing opportunity, began to request more gospel performances. Concert promoters asked if he might include hymns alongside the rock anthems in his sets. For the first time, the same critics who had ridiculed him for years were writing cautiously respectful columns. Perhaps, one wrote in the New York Times, Elvis Presley is not simply a phase of popular culture, but a voice shaped by deeper roots than many of us cared to admit. The chain reaction could not be stopped. What had begun as a potential ambush by a preacher turned into a national turning point. The hymn sung in that wooden church had carried farther than anyone imagined, across newspapers, radio waves, living rooms, and concert halls. And in its wake, the image of Elvis Presley was altered forever. He was still the king of rock and roll to millions, but to others, some for the first time, he was also the boy from Tupelo who sang hymns beside his mother, the man who could bridge the gap between pews and stages, between rebellion and reverence. And though controversy would never fully leave him, from that moment onward, the conversation around Elvis was no longer just about scandal. It was about faith, sincerity, and the mysterious power of a voice that had turned judgment into something resembling grace. By the late 1970s, the applause that had once thundered through stadiums still followed Elvis Presley, but it no longer carried the same thrill. He was exhausted, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Fame, which had once felt like a current pulling him upward, now pressed on him like a weight he could never set down. Nights stretched long, filled with restless pacing through Graceland's halls, prescription bottles rattling on bedside tables, the air heavy with loneliness even when rooms were full of people. Yet amid the weariness, he often returned to a memory he never spoke of publicly. That evening in the Tennessee church. To those closest to him, he confessed that, of all the stages he had commanded, Vegas showrooms, television specials, coliseums packed with screaming fans, it was that sanctuary, with its creaking wooden pews and hostile stares, that stayed with him most. "That's where I remembered who I was," he told a bodyguard once, his voice quiet. "Not the king, not the star, just a boy singing with his mama." He never stopped weaving gospel into his life. In concerts, between the glittering jumpsuits and crowd-pleasers, he would slip in hymns like "How Great Thou Art" or "Amazing Grace." Often, he sang them not for applause, but for himself. His voice, even strained from years of touring, carried a depth that audiences felt in their bones. Many said those moments were when Elvis seemed most alive, as if fame fell away and only faith remained. One night, after a sold-out performance in Las Vegas, he lingered on stage long after the crowd had gone. The staff expected him to head backstage, but instead he walked to the piano, sat down, and began playing softly. A few close friends, still packing up equipment, froze as his voice rose in the empty hall. He sang "How Great Thou Art," with an intensity that filled the vacant seats as though thousands still sat there. There was no spotlight, no cheering, only the sound of his voice echoing against the darkened rafters. Charlie Hodge, a longtime friend, later recalled, "It was like he forgot we were there. He wasn't performing, he was praying." Those who witnessed it never forgot the sight of Elvis, hunched over the piano, eyes closed, pouring out a hymn as if the world beyond that room did not exist. The contradictions of his life never left him. He was called a sinner by some, a savior of popular music by others. He wore both crowns uneasily. But in quiet hours, with a Bible resting on the table or a gospel record spinning on the phonograph, he seemed at peace. He would tell friends, "They can call me whatever they want. At the end of the day, I'm still that kid from Tupelo who just wanted to sing in church. Even one of his harshest early critics, a minister who had once denounced him as an agent of corruption, came to visit him in private during those years. The old man, frail and humbled, admitted that time had changed his view. "I thought your music would destroy faith," he confessed. "But I see now, faith found its way into your music." Elvis listened quietly, then replied with a small nod. "Maybe that's all I ever wanted." Those closest to him say that in his final years, Elvis often sought solace, not in the roar of crowds, but in the stillness after a song. He cherished the silence that followed a hymn more than the applause that followed a rock anthem. "It's in the silence," he once told a friend, "that you hear what the music was really for." That silence became his truest legacy. For though the world remembers the glitter, the stagecraft, the frenzy of his concerts, those who stood near him in private remember something else. A man who carried his mother's Bible, who sang hymns in the dead of night, who never stopped wrestling with the God he had met as a boy in a wooden church in Tupelo. When his final years closed in on him, he was not thinking of headlines or scandals. He was thinking of music as prayer. On one of his last nights, seated at a piano in Graceland's quiet living room, he sang softly into the dim light, not for records, not for fame, but for himself and for the God he had never abandoned. Those who listened swore that his voice, ragged, aged, yet filled with yearning, carried more power in that small room than it ever had in arenas. And when the last note faded, there was no applause, no shouting crowd, only silence. A silence that felt not empty, but full, as though the music itself had settled into the air and chosen to remain. That silence was his answer to every sermon, every critic, every accusation hurled against him. It was stronger than defense, stronger than spectacle. It was the final gesture of a life lived between the sacred and the profane. A reminder that behind the king of rock and roll was always a boy from Tupelo, singing for his God.